A small clinical study on people with type 2 diabetes found that 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, taken before bed, lowered fasting blood glucose measured the following morning by somewhere between 4 and 6%. That is not a dramatic number stated on its own, and it should not be mistaken for one. But fasting glucose is a number doctors actually track over time to judge how well a person's blood sugar is being managed, and a consistent, reproducible 4 to 6% reduction from something as simple as diluted vinegar is the kind of finding that earns a second look rather than a dismissal. The mechanism behind this is not mysterious, and it does not require believing anything unusual about vinegar as a substance. Apple cider vinegar contains acetic acid, and acetic acid interferes with the digestive enzymes responsible for breaking starches down into simple sugars the bloodstream can absorb quickly. Slow that breakdown process down, and the resulting rise in blood sugar after a meal is gentler and more gradual, which reduces the size of the insulin response the body has to mount in reaction. This is not the same as blocking carbohydrate absorption outright. It is closer to spreading the same absorption out over more time, avoiding the sharp spike a fast-digesting starch would otherwise produce. A separate line of research looks specifically at insulin sensitivity, a different but related measurement, testing what happened when people with existing insulin resistance consumed vinegar before a carbohydrate-heavy meal. The improvement in insulin sensitivity researchers documented in that trial reached as high as 34% compared to a placebo condition, a considerably larger effect than the fasting glucose numbers alone would suggest, and a reminder that vinegar's actual mechanism touches more than one part of how the body processes a meal. A systematic review published in early 2025 pooled data across 7 separate controlled clinical trials, specifically examining apple cider vinegar's effect on fasting blood sugar, and found a statistically significant reduction across the pooled results. This matters more than any single trial on its own, because pooling multiple independent studies helps separate a real, reproducible effect from the kind of result that shows up once in a small trial and then fails to replicate. 7 trials agreeing on direction, even with modest individual effect sizes, is meaningfully stronger evidence than any one of them alone. None of this evidence is unanimous, and stating that plainly matters more here than in almost any other entry in a video like this, because blood sugar management is not a category where overstating a food's effect is a harmless exaggeration. Some trials in the broader vinegar and glucose literature have shown smaller effects, or effects that did not reach statistical significance in isolation, and the overall body of research has been described by researchers reviewing it as showing a real but modest effect, not a settled, dramatic one. Vinegar is not insulin. It is not metformin. It is a dietary intervention with a real, mechanistically explainable, and repeatedly measured effect on blood sugar that happens to be small enough that it functions as a complement to medical treatment for diabetes, never a replacement for it. Vinegar as a folk remedy for blood sugar and general metabolic complaints has a documented history stretching back further than most people would guess. Hippocrates is recorded prescribing vinegar mixtures for various ailments in ancient Greece, and vinegar tonics show up across multiple traditional medicine systems long before anyone understood glucose metabolism, insulin, or digestive enzymes. The more direct ancestor of the modern apple cider vinegar trend traces to a Vermont country doctor named DeForest Clinton Jarvis, whose 1950s book on folk medicine popularized the specific combination of apple cider vinegar and honey as a general tonic, based on generations of rural Vermont household practice, rather than clinical research, decades before researchers began testing vinegar's effect on blood glucose in a controlled setting. The folk tradition and the modern clinical finding arrived at roughly the same substance through entirely different paths. Observation accumulated over generations in one case, randomized controlled trials in the other, which is a pattern that shows up often enough across traditional remedies that it deserves more credit than it usually gets before the science catches up to explain the mechanism. Why before bed specifically, rather than with a meal, which is how most of the earlier vinegar and blood sugar research was actually structured? The nighttime timing relates to a phenomenon called the dawn phenomenon, a natural rise in blood glucose that occurs in the early morning hours in many people, diabetic and non-diabetic alike, driven by hormonal changes, cortisol, and growth hormone among them, that the body releases to prepare for waking and daytime activity. In someone with impaired insulin sensitivity, this natural morning glucose rise can be more pronounced and take longer to come back down. Vinegar consumed before sleep, still exerting its effect on carbohydrate metabolism and insulin sensitivity through the overnight hours, appears in the research measuring fasting morning glucose, specifically to blunt this dawn rise somewhat, which is a plausible explanation for why the before-bed timing shows up as its own distinct area of study, rather than simply being interchangeable with taking vinegar at any other time of day. It is worth pausing on the word fix, since it shows up in how this kind of finding gets marketed far more than it shows up in the actual research. A 4 to 6% reduction in fasting glucose is not fixing anything in the sense that word implies to most viewers: a problem eliminated, a number normalized. It is a measurable, real, statistically documented shift in one direction, occurring alongside whatever else a person's diabetes management already includes: medication, diet, exercise, sleep. Researchers studying vinegar's glucose effects have generally framed it as an adjunct, something layered onto existing management, rather than a standalone treatment. And the honest video title would probably read closer to modestly improves rather than fixes, if headlines were written by the researchers running these trials, rather than by people optimizing for clicks. A woman in her late 50s managing pre-diabetes, caught early through a routine annual blood panel, rather than any symptoms she had noticed herself, added the diluted vinegar habit alongside walking after dinner and cutting back on the refined carbohydrates that had crept into her diet over the previous several years. She was not interested in any single intervention in isolation. Her endocrinologist had explained that prediabetes responds best to several modest changes stacked together, rather than one dramatic one, and the vinegar became one small piece of a larger pattern, rather than the centerpiece of it. Her fasting glucose at her next panel, 6 months later, had moved from the prediabetic range back into normal range, a result her doctor attributed to the combination of changes rather than any single one, which is both a less exciting story than a single food reversing a diagnosis, and a considerably more accurate description of how these interventions actually tend to work in practice. The practical version of this, the tablespoon in the video's title, deserves some precision, because undiluted vinegar and improperly diluted vinegar create real problems that a vague instruction to just take a spoonful glosses over entirely. Apple cider vinegar is acidic enough, with a pH typically between 2 and 3, that taken undiluted it can damage tooth enamel with repeated exposure and irritate the esophagus and stomach lining, particularly in anyone with existing acid reflux or a sensitive digestive tract. The trials showing benefit generally diluted the vinegar substantially, commonly 1 to 2 tablespoons stirred into a full glass of water, rather than taken as a straight shot, the way some viral health content depicts it. Drinking it through a straw reduces direct contact with tooth enamel, and rinsing the mouth with plain water afterward, without brushing immediately, since brushing right after an acid exposure can work the acid further into softened enamel, further reduces the dental risk. There is a meaningful drug interaction worth naming directly rather than burying in fine print. Anyone taking insulin or a sulfonylurea class medication for diabetes, drugs that already lower blood sugar directly, needs to treat added vinegar as something that could compound that effect, potentially pushing blood sugar low enough to cause hypoglycemia, particularly overnight while asleep, and less able to notice or respond to early symptoms. This is not a reason to avoid vinegar. It is a specific, concrete reason to discuss adding it with whoever manages that medication. The same conversation that should happen before adding any intervention, food or supplement, that independently affects blood sugar in someone already on glucose-lowering medication. It is also worth situating vinegar against other before-bed interventions researchers have studied for the same dawn phenomenon and fasting glucose target, since a viewer genuinely trying to manage blood sugar deserves the comparison rather than a single food presented in isolation. A late evening short walk has shown measurable effects on next morning glucose in some research, working through a different mechanism, muscle glucose uptake independent of insulin, than vinegar's digestive enzyme effect. Cinnamon, another kitchen ingredient with a body of research behind it, appears to work through yet another distinct pathway, improving insulin receptor sensitivity, with its own separate and also modest evidence base. None of these compete with each other. A person could reasonably use all three: vinegar before bed, a short walk after dinner, cinnamon incorporated into food, and the research on each does not suggest they cancel each other out, or that combining them meaningfully raises risk, beyond the same insulin medication caution that applies to vinegar specifically. Choosing the vinegar itself matters less than the dosing and dilution details, though raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, the kind sold with a visible cloudy sediment called the mother, contains the same acetic acid as filtered, pasteurized versions along with some additional bacterial and enzyme content from the fermentation process, without strong evidence that this additional content meaningfully changes the blood sugar effect specifically. The acetic acid concentration, not the presence of the mother, is what the clinical research has actually measured and connected to the glucose findings, which means a person choosing a clear, filtered vinegar over the cloudier, unfiltered version is not meaningfully sacrificing the blood sugar benefit the trials documented, whatever other reasons might exist to prefer one over the other. What makes this a genuinely interesting entry, distinct from many of the more speculative claims that circulate about specific foods and blood sugar, is how directly traceable the effect is to a specific, identifiable mechanism: acetic acid slowing starch digestion and modestly improving insulin sensitivity, replicated across multiple independent trials with a consistent, if modest, direction of effect. It will not fix blood sugar for someone whose diabetes requires medication to manage safely. What the evidence actually supports is smaller and more useful than either extreme: a real, mechanistically sound, modestly sized effect, available from something already sitting in most kitchens, worth trying specifically because the downside, properly diluted and used with awareness of the medication interaction, is close to nothing.